This is Conversations on Careers and Professional Life, a podcast from the Foster School of Business, MBA Career Management Office. I'm your host, Gregory Heller. On each episode, I talk with guests from faculty and staff to students, alumni, and business leaders about the skills and strategies that can help you design a professional career that you're happy with. My guest today is Charlie Donovan, visiting professor of sustainable finance at the Foster School of Business. Charlie is also a senior economic advisor at Impacts Asset Management. He received his BA from the University of Washington and MBA from Vanderbilt's Owen Graduate School of Management and doctorate from IE Business School in Madrid. At Foster, Charlie teaches Fin 579, Climate Change and Capital Markets. And over winter break in 2022, he co-led an MBA study tour to Costa Rica, focusing in part on that country's sustainability efforts. Charlie Donovan, welcome to Conversations on Careers and Professional Life.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
I wanted to bring you on in part to talk about the trip to Costa Rica and to hear about how it fits together with Fin 579, but also to get your advice as someone who works in this climate space for our students and prospective students and my other listeners who are interested in working in climate change, climate mitigation, carbon drawdown, carbon accounting, and all the associated fields that exist in this space. So can we start by talking a little bit about 579?
Sure. So Fin 579 was a class that I started here at Foster. I hadn't taught it previously. And the idea was to really be a survey. So many years ago, you would have had the interest in climate or sustainability. You probably would have had a really hard time connecting that to finance. But we've seen a huge change over the past few years in which banks and asset managers and insurers, private equity, everyone is getting to grips with this issue seemingly at the same time. And so the course was really meant to be a survey of those different approaches. And really what the approach that is common to all of them is an understanding of risk, an understanding of what is this thing, climate, what is the boundary of climate in terms of being a public problem, which we all are seeing and recognizing, versus what does that mean to an investment firm? What is the fiduciary duty of, say, an asset manager to think about these risks, quantify these risks, and ultimately integrate them into the way that they think about the value of the companies that they're investing in. So that's what the course was meant to be about.
And how do you then, from surveying this, how do you students then put it into practice within the course to put themselves in the shoes of the roles that hopefully they'll get at some point in the future?
Well, that's the trick. That's a great question, because when you survey something, it means inevitably you're not going as deep as you might. But I have to say that when I first arrived at Foster, I taught the course for the first year in a slightly different way. And I found that actually it was more the breadth than the depth that was really what people needed. So there are a lot of students that are coming to this out of a general area of interest, but may have not, certainly haven't had a scientific training in climate, although I was really pleased to have a couple of students this year who did. Maybe have not spent a lot of time in particular industries, say like the energy industry that has been dealing with these for quite a long time. So there was let's say a curiosity and a bit of an itch that needed to be scratched that was about how these different aspects fit together. Now, how does a student or how does an individual who's going back into the working world implement that? You know, what I said all the time was that this is not enough, and don't consider that you come out of, one course like this and feel like you're suddenly a climate expert. I have a colleague who's been talking a lot about green competency washing. So competency washing being, you take a class on edX or you do a 2-week program and somehow now you're an expert. So this is a really a starting point, and I meant it to be that way, which is hopefully a door that people walk through, find that it really resonates with their areas of interest, and hopefully provides a path towards what one would need to do to really develop a field of expertise that they could implement that in the working world.
In your syllabus, you write that a critical skills gap is emerging, with companies currently paying a substantial premium for graduates with capabilities in environmental, social, and governance, ESG, investing, and sustainable finance. So if there's that skills gap, and a class like Fin 579 is a survey that is designed to give people maybe a foundation or broad understanding, what's some advice that you have for students who want to fill that skills gap in themselves so that they are ready for these roles that companies are looking to fill with qualified people?
I remember a conversation I had just before leaving London with the head of strategy for one of the major banks that is headquartered in London. And he said to me that we are not hiring anybody at the analyst or associate level these days that doesn't come in with either a grounding in sustainability or in data science. And I thought that was really, I've held that in my mind because there are these twin pairings of, what are the skill sets that you can bring these days? As we get further and further into the AI revolution, as we get further into the knowledge offshoring revolution, it becomes very difficult. What do you hold on to as a unique creative skill? And I don't use that word too lightly when it comes to finance, because it's not thought of as an area with a huge amount of creativity. But in fact, that's what a lot of employers are looking for these days, because the stuff that can be done automated, the stuff that's pure calculation, the stuff that can be done in a spreadsheet, there's probably somebody that can do that faster and cheaper than you somewhere in the world today. So it's really about these skills of synthesizing information, about approaching something where there's deep uncertainty, where it's not even quite clear what the question is, much less the answer. And that kind of critical thinking skill is the one that I think is crucial. And in a lot of ways, part of the frustration I understood for some people in the class was, what's the exam question here? And the exam question is one that's evolving. And ultimately, it becomes about what should these firms be doing about this great challenge that we have before us that's going to lead to an industrial transformation. I'm clear on that. And that will begin to touch on every aspect of every industry on the planet, but it's not clear what that pathway is and how that's going to play out, and which technologies will play a role, what policies will be part of it, and ultimately how the world is going to adapt. So it's very much an emergent problem, and one that I think relies as much as on critical thinking as it does on, say, pure financial or economic skills.
So let's get into Costa Rica. So with that grounding, why Costa Rica, and what were students able to see and experience there that would help them, for those who took the class, contextualize some of what they learned, for those who didn't take the class, maybe get them started on this road towards thinking about climate risk and sustainability?
Well, let's get the elephant in the room on the table. How does one take a group of students, fly in an unsustainable way down to Costa Rica to learn about sustainability? That was something that was front of mind for me right off the bat. But I think it was such a compelling opportunity for several reasons. One, Costa Rica as a country really defies a lot of what would be the preconceived notions that many of us would have about a quote unquote developing country. So Costa Rica sits in Latin America and Central America with a lot of very, very poor countries around it. So Honduras, Nicaragua. Costa Rica has managed some form of exceptionalism. And this has always been a source of kind of curiosity to me about how do certain countries, even within the same region, manage to get themselves in a very different place than their neighbors. So there's something, about economic history and thinking about what are really the determinants of wealth for a community or a country or a region. So that was a starting point for me. The second thing was, having been there myself many, many years ago, was a knowledge that Costa Rica had put sustainability at the heart of its modern transformation. So just after the Second World War, the leaders of Costa Rica abolished the military and made constitutional amendments around health and education spending that really put Costa Rica on an entirely different path. And the idea that sustainability was an input to the process of becoming richer and becoming better off, as opposed to the kind of the conventional wisdom, which is, well, you have to get rich first and then you can afford to deal with things like clean water or healthcare. Then that was also a source of appeal. And, I'm really grateful that a lot of the reactions that folks had who came on the trip, who hadn't been in the region, I think that they were really, blown away by the dynamics of seeing, Costa Rica is not the United States. It's not Europe. There are still some really basic challenges there. But the depth to which the sense of sustainability, about thinking about social and environmental issues as part of a holistic set of thinking about what are we here to do as people. I was really impressed. I came away from it with a fresh view and a lot of inspiration that the change that we talk about in the classroom is actually possible, but it requires a commitment to community and community-led development in a way that many countries simply struggle to do.
So for students who either went on that trip or didn't go on that trip, but are thinking, wow, that sounds really cool, when they're off in the workplace, how can they bring those lessons or this idea that, community comes first, or the ideas around sustainability, how can they begin to bring those into the work that they do if they are not in explicitly a sustainability role?
I'm really grateful that after the trip, I've met with several students, MBA students who were on the trip, and their question was, this was really powerful for me. This really was a defining moment in terms of some of the thinking that I've been doing around wanting to have more of this in my career. What should I do next? And I think my advice uniformly, of course, everybody's different, but uniformly has been keep doing exactly what you're doing. Don't try to jump too quick into something that feels like it has a sustainability badge on it or is recognized as, this little department that kind of thinks about this stuff. What we're moving into is a world in which these skills are going to be more embedded. So as of today, you have chief sustainability officers, you have people who are basically tasked with thinking about these issues. And I think the future is for maybe not everybody in the firm, but certainly a lot more. And we're seeing this, in the chief strategy officer. We're seeing this certainly now in the chief financial officer. For a long time, it's been the purview of the chief executive officer and the teams that sit underneath them, is to have at least a basic awareness. It's not a possibility anymore to know nothing about these issues. So my first piece of advice is actually don't do anything. Don't do anything radical quite yet, because if this is something that you're passionate about and you want to make a difference, there are still a lot of ways through conventional career paths that you can find a way to branch out. And so whereas maybe 10 years ago, if you wanted to get into this stuff, you really just needed to jump into something that had that on its department title or on its name tag, I don't think that's quite the case so much today. So it's much more important for me to see the opportunities to do that and to lead initiatives from exactly where that person is today, and less so about trying to find, some perfect home in which they'll feel like they're amongst like-minded people. The actual change that we need is around mainstreaming these concepts, and that starts with people who are certainly less aware of the imperative that many of us see.
Is there one book or resource that you would point someone who's interested in starting down this path towards?
I had two books that I think were really definitive for me. One was by an economist called Herman Daly, called For the Common Good. So while I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. as my first sort of real job, and was really fortunate to have a class that was sponsored by the EPA with Herman Daly. And he is what is kind of known as the father of ecological economics. And so this is a field which tries to look at economics as if the planet matters. And that sounds maybe ironic that wouldn't already be part of economics, but actually we have been in a 30, 40-year cycle in which economics has very successfully seen the natural world as an input, or as something external to the economy and all the processes that it studies. So that was a big piece. And then the second one is Paul Hawken's book, The Ecology of Commerce, which is a lot easier read, I'll say, not so much a textbook, but a fairly easy airport-style book to read. And this was a wake-up call. I think it really consolidated for me a lot of the concepts that I had been in my mind. And to see somebody who had been successful in business write a book that was a real call to action like that, was inspiring. And so I keep both of those books on my shelf and would really recommend them to anybody who's interested in this space.
So those are two books that came out in the past. Are there contemporary resources that you use in the course or that you point people to who want to stay up to date on what's happening now with regard to these concepts in business?
The problem there is that by the time somebody gets done writing a book, and I have to say that I'm the worst culprit here. I've had a book contract with Columbia University Press to write a new book on climate, and I feel like every time I get a chapter in, I feel like I would want to throw that chapter away because things have changed again and it's out of date. Now, I'm sure that that's not entirely true. It might be a little hard on myself there, but I do find that for classes, there is no textbook. A lot of cases, a lot of contemporary readings, a lot of news articles, some amount of white papers and policy briefs from within industry. That's really what has been filling up the coffers of my reading lists, over the last few years. And in turn, I think that that's what I've offered up to students is you need to see what people in the industry are saying about this, how they're interpreting that, and then think critically about it, because there's a lot of people who are in positions in which they are writing about climate or sustainability, biodiversity. And let's say we're a little skeptical that there's a strong mastery of kind of the underlying concepts at play. These days, I think I probably read a lot less books and a lot more industry and academic white papers that try to shed new light on what is a very, very complex phenomenon, and means that anything you thought you knew maybe even a year or two ago continually needs to be updated.
For those of us whose idea of a beach read is not an academic white paper, are there popular business outlets that you look to? I know I've had some guests on who say, oh, you got to read Bloomberg Green, which I do now, and I find it very interesting, but that still seems fairly mainstream. Are there others out there that you would point people to?
Well, two things. I continue to read, although I've been gone from the UK for a couple of years, I still read the Financial Times every day. I think it's a great newspaper. It has definitely a much larger focus on climate and related issues. So I think as a daily newspaper, it makes a lot of sense. The other thing that I find interesting to read is actually to read stuff like Fox News and read stuff which is not saying what I would like it to say. And because I'm still curious and searching for what are the messages around this that resonate with, and maybe everybody's too much, but let's say, the vast majority of people, because everybody likes clean water. Everybody wants healthy air. Everybody wants their kids to feel safe. And everybody wants to know that they're moving into a future in which the opportunities ahead of them are better than those in the past. Why can't we find more consensus about how an issue like climate change affects us all, and why can't we find the language that resonates with the mainstream? And so from time to time, when I can, read stuff that is very much outside of that wheelhouse, an opposite take than you'd find in something like Bloomberg Green, really strengthens a person in terms of finding where do I find common ground? How do I sell a story like this within an organization? How do I make the business case for this without appealing solely to an individual's emotions? That's an ongoing challenge, and try with what I read to see if I can stretch my own thinking in that way.
So as we come to the end of our time talking about this, tell me a little bit about the Climate Risk Lab at the University of Washington.
The Climate Risk Lab, I'm really proud of, was an idea. There was a company that's really on the cutting edge of this field called climate risk analytics, called riskthinking.ai. Would really encourage people to check out their website. The founder there and CEO is actually a former Yale academic. And we met and hit it off. And he said, the last time we did something like this for a previous company that he had built and then sold on to one of the credit rating agencies, they worked very closely with the University of Toronto to create a new degree, a master's degree around financial risk engineering. And at that point, nobody had put those words together, and nobody really knew what he was talking about when he said this is going to be a thing. And his view, which I very much share, is that there's going to be a competency going forward around climate risk engineers. And that doesn't mean that you know how to engineer the climate, but you know how to think about risk and do all the fancy things that you can do for risk in financial markets for more commonly understood topics. So long story short, we started this venture within Foster. I'm really grateful that the University of Washington president has endorsed and provided seed funding for us to get this underway. And the idea is to give students and faculty an opportunity to tap into some of these really cutting edge tools that do exist in industry, but have not quite made their way into our curriculum. And in a lot of ways to act as a bit of a sandbox, can get familiar with what these tools are, how to use them, and ultimately think about how they can incorporate that to their own career choices going forward.
So for students at the University of Washington or at Foster specifically who want to learn more about the Climate Risk Lab or get involved, how can they do that?
Well, at the moment, we're in stealth mode, let's
Okay.
call it.
Cat's out of the bag now. Sorry to blow your cover.
Not at all. They're really welcome to get in touch with me individually. We're looking towards next year of, let's say, better institutionalizing. There's a lot to do to kind of create something like this, and talking with partners across the University of Washington campus. There's folks in the Allen School. There's folks in the Public Policy School that have these areas of interest. And so we've been spending our first period of time trying to figure out how to build the foundations for something that would be cross-disciplinary and attract students from multiple departments. And I think next year is when we start to roll out more in terms of events and hackathons and programs and kind of the opportunities to get involved in research. So in the interim, people, really happy to hear people's interest in this. And there is a student committee that's been working on that, and I'd be happy to put people in touch with the students who are pushing forward and creating this new venture.
Great. And I'll put links in the show notes on this podcast, which people can find at conversationsoncareers.com. So last question, do you think there'll be another similar study tour to Costa Rica or to another locale to examine these similar kinds of issues?
Well, now I don't know if I can put the cat out of the bag, but there is another program in the works. It's a little further afield, and I'll just say as a preview, it coincides with an area of interest that's been increasing in me quite strongly over the last couple of years, which is around the nexus of climate change and the blue economy. And this is a fascinating area because even in climate change more generally, we're always dealing in some way with public goods. So whether that's water or energy, these are the things that kind of governments provide. And there's a sense that, the private sector should help make it more efficient, but it shouldn't get too involved because there's something kind of not right about that. And when you get into something like the oceans or forests or really, now the big question is, well, what could the private sector possibly do to undo the problems that we've created, let's say, in the ocean? So there's a lot of entrepreneurship that's actually happening. Maybe there's some happening here in Seattle, but I've been exposed to a couple of places in the world where there is a real fascinating set of developments occurring in which things like debt for nature swaps, blue bonds, very innovative tools to trying to push money into solutions at a more community level, which will allow for the kind of restoration that we need in the oceans. Because as the oceans go, we all go. And this is probably, again, a few years ago wouldn't have been seen as a business issue, but it's very much at the edge of where a lot of organizations are now thinking, how do we get involved in this? How do we make a difference? So the next study program is going to be based on that. But I won't give away the location quite yet.
Okay. Well, you heard it here, sort of, first. Charlie Donovan, thank you so much for having this conversation on careers and professional life.
Thank you. My pleasure.
I appreciated Charlie's perspective on the rapid pace with which the sustainability space is evolving. Perhaps the only thing moving faster these days is generative AI. I think Charlie is spot on with the idea that every business role in every organization has begun, or will soon, to take into consideration issues related to sustainability and climate change or climate risk. I hear this a lot. Every job can be a climate job. So before you jump from the job you're in to try and find one that has sustainability in the title, you might be best served by thinking about how you can bring sustainability into your current role now. And if you're a student seeking a job, you can think about ways you can bring sustainability considerations into the roles that you're applying for. A few other things he pointed out that stood out to me. Climate change and sustainability are becoming well integrated into finance, including banks, asset managers, and insurers. And these companies and roles within them now require a fundamental understanding of climate-related risks and their impact on investments. This sounds like a great place for MBA students to think about focusing their career search. The other was the idea of competency washing when it comes to sustainability. And this is something that I'm certainly going to look into more. Charlie advises students to build the foundational knowledge in these areas to set themselves apart. And it doesn't mean just getting a certification or taking an online course in the discipline, though that could certainly be part of the approach. As always, I'll put links in the show notes at conversationsoncareers.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please consider sharing it with a friend or classmate, or leave us a rating or review wherever you listen. Conversations on Careers and Professional Life is produced by me, Gregory Heller, with support from the Foster School of Business Office of MBA Career Management. Learn more about the show, find show notes, and past episodes, and get in touch with me at conversationsoncareers.com. This episode was produced with editing and engineering support from Amelia Nguyen, a student in the Communication Leadership Master's Program at the University of Washington, and made possible in part with funding from Snowcap, a venture capital firm investing in early-stage platforms that directly and indirectly solve the climate crisis. Learn more at snowcap.vc. That's snocap.vc.